Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third and final session in the Superpower Institute's three-part webinar series on green iron in Australia. My name is Adam Grant, and I'm Director of Communications at TSI. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're hosting this webinar today on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and also the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation over in the West, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present and recognize their enduring connection to land, water, and culture. So this series is dedicated to unpacking TSI's latest report, A Green Iron Plan for Australia, Securing Prosperity in a Decarbonising World, which is a blueprint for how Australia can lead in the production and export of low emissions iron. You may have caught our earlier two presentations. If so, welcome again. But if not, and you'd like to catch those, you can access recordings of those in full on our website, superpowerinstitute.com.au, and just follow the links to the Green Iron report page. So this week, today, Max van Someren and Ben Scott will be presenting the process and results of our detailed regional modelling across 5 prospective production zones, comparing costs, infrastructure, and energy needs across different parts of Australia. If you have questions at any time during the session, feel free to post them in the Q&A section in your dashboard. We'll do our best to address those, as many of those at the completion of the presentation. So that's enough from me. I'll hand over now to Ingrid Burford.
Thank you, Adam, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Ingrid Burford, the lead of carbon pricing and policy at the Superpower Institute. In case you're not familiar with us and our work, TSI is an independent economic research and policy institute, and we're focused on accelerating investment and global trade in clean, energy-intensive products. We very recently released a report, A Green Iron Plan for Australia. To describe the modelling that underpins our analysis and results in that report, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague Ben Scott and Max van Someren from Bivios. Ben is an economist at TSI with a Master's in Applied Econometrics. He has been awarded a Westpac Future Leader Scholarship and undertaken research for the United Nations, Gladstone Institute, and the Australian Parliament. Max is an energy system analyst and the Australian director of Bivios, a sustainability strategy and energy advisory company. Like TSI, Bivios is focused on the energy transition. And so it was an absolute joy to work really closely with Max on the model that he is presenting today, alongside Ben, who had a real focus on developing some of the inputs, and that's the work that he'll be presenting. So without any further delay from me, I'm going to pass over to Max. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. Okay. Well, thanks very much to everyone for joining us today. We're going to run through an overview of the model, and then I'll hand over to Ben, who will talk about the model inputs and the data sources. I'll then take the baton back to talk about the sensitivity analysis, which is buried deep in the appendices of the report, but is of great interest to me and hopefully to you as well. Before finishing off with some select insights from the model, and then we'll allow some time for Q&A as well. On the right, you can see the kind of fiery image, which is typical of a green iron report. I like working on green iron because it's an exciting prospect and an exciting opportunity to contribute to thinking about Australia's economic future. But what we're going to talk about today isn't quite so fiery and visually exciting. We're going to talk about the model, and it's a Python-based model. It's lines of code, and I'm going to present lots of graphs. But nonetheless, I think it is exciting because it underpins the strong evidence base for the policy recommendations which TSI makes in this report. So let me take you through the model. We can think about the modeling process in 3 different nested layers, a bit like an onion. So in the middle, we have the simulation of our iron production system, and I'm going to spend the majority of the time today talking through that. Outside of that, we then have an optimization process. So that runs the simulation, hundreds of different times to come up with the optimal configuration of the iron making system to give you the lowest levelized cost of iron. And then we take those results and we post-process them into the results which were presented in the report. So let's meet the model. This is an overview of the different components of the hourly simulation. What sets this model apart from many others is that it's holistic. It starts with the production of renewable energy on the left-hand side and goes right the way through to iron making. So there are some other very good models which take the cost of hydrogen per kilo as an input, or they might take the cost of electricity per megawatt hour as an input. But we actually build up our cost structure from the base components. What's not shown in this simplified view is that electricity, water, and hydrogen also have stores associated with them as well. And that's quite important when understanding the dynamic behavior of the model. So we have a battery, we have a water store, and a hydrogen store. And we'll talk through in a minute how those are filled and emptied as the model marches through its simulation. As you can see from the title, it's an hourly model, so it's dynamic. It takes in on the left-hand side inputs of historic renewable energy data, so wind data, solar irradiance data, and then correlated information on the connected grid electricity, so the spot market for electricity as well. So the emissions intensity of the electricity grid and the wholesale market prices. In each hour, the first thing that the model needs to do is to identify how much of the input resource is required to meet the iron demand. This model always wants to produce as much iron as it can, so it produces up to the limits of the constraints which are put upon it. We can feed back from the target amount of iron, so the nameplate capacity of the iron making plant. We can feed that back to the requirement of hydrogen, the requirement of water, and the requirement of electricity. Electricity is an input into all stages of the process, and the largest consumer by far is the hydrogen. So everything really comes back to understanding what your electricity supply needs to be. As I mentioned before, we use historic weather data to estimate the availability of renewable electricity, and that will depend on the specific configuration of the model which we're running, so the size of your solar farm, the size of your wind farm. If there is sufficient renewables available, then the whole system will run off renewable energy. However, if there is insufficient renewable energy available in that hour, well, the first thing the system will do is it will look to the battery. So is there sufficient electricity in the battery that can draw upon? If the battery is empty or the power outputs of the battery are exceeded, then the system will look at behind the meter gas turbines if they've been included in the simulation. We didn't actually include them in the core cases which we present in the report, but they are presented in some of the variations later on in the report. And then finally, if there's still a shortfall of electricity, then the system will turn to the electricity grid, and it will look to the grid for firming power up to the limit of emissions constraints which we've applied. And for our core cases, that meant staying within the constraints of the hydrogen production tax incentive, 600 kilos of CO2 per ton of hydrogen produced. Now, if we're in the happy situation where we have excess renewable energy, then the first thing that we do is try and fill the battery behind the meter. If we've still got excess electricity, that can be sold back to the electricity grid. And if we have hit the limits of the grid or the price of electricity is actually negative, then the system will curtail, so it will stop the production of renewable energy. If we're in the situation where there is insufficient electricity available after all those measures have been taken, then we need to look at how electricity is rationed out between the different consumers. And we set a priority demand order. And this is where my background as an engineer really comes through, because I've made a series of prioritized decisions rather than doing any sort of market-based approach to sharing out the electricity. That's a simplification, but we found it's actually quite effective in this circumstance, because the priorities are quite clear. Water only draws on a very small amount of electricity, but it's critical to the functioning of the rest of the system. So water receives electricity first. Then we give electricity to the production of iron to ensure the iron making plant runs as much as possible. And only then is electricity supplied into hydrogen production, which takes at least 70% of the electricity in most of the cases. And that's where we tend to see the most variability knocking through from the variable supply of the renewable energy into the actual production of the hydrogen. Now, there is a situation where the production of hydrogen is also influenced by something else. That is if we allow the model to export electricity back into the wholesale electricity market when electricity prices are particularly high. So in that situation, we establish a certain break-even price where it's essentially more valuable to supply electricity, which we have back into the wholesale market, rather than supply that into the iron-making process. In that situation, the electrolyzer will stop and any excess electricity is provided back into the electricity grid. That revenue can then offset some of the costs of iron production. And that's an important feature of the model, which will knock on through to the results, which we'll present later. So once we've done all of that, we've got a picture of supply and a picture of demand, and there is then some iteration required in the model because there is some interaction between these different things, which means that it can't all be solved at once. But at the end of the hour, you end up with a balanced picture for the amount of electricity which is supplied and the amount of iron which is produced. So you've got an output volume of iron. You've also got a calculation of input costs of grid electricity, any natural gas that you've used, and the amount of iron ore that you've used as well. And then the whole thing begins again. So you pass the state of the system into the next hour. The critical aspect of the state which is passed on, and which makes the system a truly dynamic system, is how full your different stores of electricity, water, and hydrogen are. In the next hour, of course, you'll also have different inputs in terms of your renewable energy and your spot market price and emissions intensity. So each cycle is an hour, but we need to simulate as a minimum an entire year. We model the 8,760 hours within a year to simulate that year. And then we take that year and we use that year multiple times to build up a life cycle cost of the system, which can then help us or is used to calculate the levelized cost of iron production. Let's now move on to the next layer out of the onion, the optimization. This graph really helped me understand what the optimization was doing. So it's worth spending a couple of minutes on to explain. On the x-axis here, we have the utilization of the iron plant. So 100% utilization, the far right, would be the situation when the plant is running all the time, every single hour of the year at maximum capacity. Obviously, if you were down at 0%, that would be the plant is completely off for the entire year. And then on the y-axis, we've got the cost of iron, the dollars per ton of production. And that is the overall complete cost, including the financing of the capital, the input variable costs, etc., divided through by the amount of iron which is produced. So we can run the simulation multiple times using different configurations. And when I say different configurations, I mean a different size solar farm, different size wind farm, different size battery, electrolyzer, hydrogen storage, water production, and iron production as well, and grid connection. And initially, when we do these multiple runs, it looks like a fairly random pattern of dots. But the more runs that we do, the more a pattern starts to emerge. And what we find is that there is a clear minimum in the cost of iron which can be achieved in a given location, so for a given set of other inputs. Now, for this example data, that lowest cost solution doesn't actually occur when the plant is 100% utilized. It occurs when you're at an 82% utilization. In some ways, that's quite counterintuitive if you're used to working with industrial systems where you expect to push the plant as hard as possible to keep it working all the time. But in this instance, if we were to try and keep that plant operating all the time, well, that might mean we might have to build more hydrogen storage, for example, or we might have to overbuild our behind-the-meter renewables to ensure that the right emissions level electricity was always available. So we find that 82% is the right point. Now, 82% can only be utilization, can only be achieved if the iron-making plant is allowed to operate flexibly, and of course, the hydrogen electrolyzers as well. That leads us into the two different technology types that we've modeled, a flexible technology and an inflexible technology. So the inflexible technology has to be operating at 100% plant utilization. An example of this is the current generation of green iron production technologies from a company like Midrex, where the reactor has to be kept hot by the reductant gases which are fed into it. And so you keep the whole thing operating all the time. On the other hand, there are technologies which are under development at the moment and are still maturing, which enable you to turn down the ion reaction based on the availability of hydrogen or electricity. So, for example, the Calyx-Zesty process, which is under development, is one example of that. So taking that all together, we can then present the costs of production across 5 different locations in Australia and 2 different technology types, flexible and inflexible. The core results which we presented are for the nth of a kind. So what that means is the first time you do this in Australia, it's going to be more expensive. There's going to be a higher risk associated for the developer. That's first of a kind, there's additional costs. Nth of a kind is once those additional costs have been passed through. We've also, as I've already described, applied a carbon intensity constraint as well of 0.6 kilograms per kilogram of green hydrogen. That aligns with the government's hydrogen production tax incentive requirements. If you want to receive $2 per kilo of hydrogen under the HPTI, then you need to stay within that requirement. So we've applied that emissions constraint as well. This is the headline results as presented in the report. And there's a couple of things that we can immediately observe. The first is that there is a clear difference between what we can achieve with flexible technology and inflexible technology. Now, these results don't take into account the technology readiness of those technologies, but they do indicate the potential of additional flexibility for reducing the cost of iron production. We can also see that the results vary significantly by location. And what I will do now is, or in one slide's time, is pass over to my colleague Ben, who will explain what the inputs are which lead to those variations. But just before I get there, and to provide a little bit more background to what Ben will present, this is a breakdown of the different inputs into that cost buildup by location. So the big thing which jumps out here is that the yellow and orange bits, which are the costs associated with renewable electricity production, are by far the majority of each bar. So green hydrogen leading to green iron is absolutely underpinned by the cost of your renewable electricity. Okay, Ben, I'll now hand over to you to take us through the model inputs and data sources. I'll try our best to move us along at the right time, but if you need me to change slides, just let me know.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Max, and thank you all again for tuning in. To keep things flowing, I'll get right into showing where we've published our underlying data inputs so that you can follow up, and please do, on whatever we aren't able to cover today. They take the form of the model input data pack and model input supplementary material, which can both be found on the TSI website under the model methodology section of the Green Iron report page. The first will probably be a lot to take in because it is in published form, quite literally what our model draws on. You'll find 122 variables organized by tabs representing the scenarios and sensitivities that we investigated. You'll also find the hourly weather, electricity prices, and grid emissions data for relevant scenarios, which are central to the optimization routine. The supplementary material then is a compilation of documented research for critical inputs. So having now seen how the model optimizes for all the different ingredients that go into iron making, I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes describing some of the main inputs that underpin the model. I'll begin by describing differences between the 5 scenarios. This will take me into a description of locational cost factors, grid assumptions, and energy generation inputs. And I'll finish up by going into some detail on our iron making inputs that feature important variation by technology, ore type, and location. So here is a high-level breakdown of the 5 scenarios we modeled across Australia. And the dimensions in which they differ. So all scenarios, bar the Pilbara, are modeled as grid connected. They are each characterized by varying provisions of sun and wind. All bar the Eyre Peninsula and Geraldton take a 62% Fe hematite ore as input, with the exceptions taking high-grade magnetite. And they also feature locationally varying costs of installing capital. And this last point is worth delving a little deeper into. So why are locational capex factors so important? Well, green energy projects are extremely capital intensive, and the iron plants themselves are too. So by applying a CapEx cost factor, we essentially take the lion's share of a given project's total cost and multiply it through. Our estimates draw on regional cost factors by cost type. We then adjusted the cost breakdowns to distinguish between what we expected to be representative installation costs for renewable and iron-making assets, taking the view that the installation of iron plants will likely have similar cost components to generator technologies such as coal and gas-powered plants. A core insight from the final report is that a suitably sized grid connection will substantially reduce the resulting LCOI of green iron plants. Max will provide some more context on this later on. And as you recall from a few slides back, we did assume that the Pilbara plant would not have a grid connection. Now, in practice, a green iron plant in the Pilbara would be able to access the Northwestern Interconnected System. But importantly, the NWIS does not have tradable energy reserves of suitable scale, as in the Swiss or the NEM. This meant that the Pilbara plant is assumed to have to invest in more energy generation to independently power all of its processes. Now, for the other grid-connected scenarios, it's clear that not all grids are made equal. Be it the Swiss or the varying regions of the NEM, grids feature different prices and emissions intensities. Cheaper energy makes it more desirable to import energy instead of building energy-generating assets. But we also treat the HCPI emissions limit that Max spoke about earlier as a hard ceiling, which means that less energy can be imported from grids with higher emissions intensities. As an important aside, you'll have noticed that West Coast scenarios draw on data from 2019, while Eastern scenarios from 2023. This is a data limitation. Given the endogeneity of weather, emissions, and energy prices, we needed complementary data sets for any single calendar year, and these are the years we had available to us. For all the wholesale electricity prices, there is an additional charge for use of the network. In the model, we vary this by a flat $22 per megawatt hour in the base case across all scenarios, $10 in the low and $35 in the high. You'll see on the graph here that network charges translated to roughly 20% of grid energy costs on a per megawatt hour basis, which roughly accords with industry understanding. We do view informed updates to this input as a driver of interstate variation, but as Max will cover later on in our sensitivity analysis, it is not likely to significantly impact the LCOI. And so now moving beyond the grid, we can turn to how energy is generated behind the meter. We tried to minimize assumptions when fielding model inputs, and this is particularly true of our decision to lean on the most recent GenCost report and its underlying Oricon data as the basis for costing solar, wind, battery, and hydrogen technologies. We are aware of much cheaper costs coming out of the likes of China that would materially reduce LCOI estimates, but we're unsure how these costs would translate to the Australian context, given availability and quality assurance concerns. Our hydrogen tank storage estimates primarily drew on the 2018 CSIRO hydrogen roadmap, but were also informed by industry consultation. These are extremely expensive compared to cavernous and depleted gas-filled storage options, which are currently being explored. So equipped with installation costs, we can now turn to the hourly production of solar and wind energy based on capacity factors. Australia, as we know, is endowed with abundant renewable resources. On an international scale, all the selected locations have outstanding sun and wind. Capacity factor data for the West Coast comes from Renewables Ninja, which draws on NASA's atmospheric analysis dataset named MERAM and the European Climate Monitoring Solar Radiation dataset named SARA. For the East, we take hourly capacity factors that underpin ISP trace data for renewable energy zones. The ISP draws on datasets from CSIRO and BOM. Now, taking stock quickly, We started off with locational cost factors and the implications for capital-heavy projects like we have here with a green iron plant. We then spoke about grids and the implications of their varying prices and emissions intensities. The lower the better for both cases. And just now, we looked at behind-the-meter energy generation and the location-specific hourly capacity factors that underpin their production. I'll now turn to the iron-making process. This chart, while a fair bit to take in at first, captures the energy demanded by different stages of the iron-making process on a megawatt hour per ton of iron basis, and each scenario represents one column. You'll notice that each location is split into flexible and inflexible cases, representing the type of energy load demanded by the direct reduction shaft technology. It is worth repeating here that the specific technologies we focused on were Calix's zero emissions steel technology, or ZESTY, as the flexible, and the Midrex vertical shaft direct reduction iron furnace as the inflexible. Taking the lower bound energy requirement for the flexible Geraldton scenario, which features a very high quality magnetite input, we have just over 4 megawatt hours per ton of HBI. For a 2.5 million ton per annum plant, this represents over 10 terawatt hours of energy per year. And to put that into context, South Australia produced 14.3 terawatt hours in 2023. And further, 2.5 million tons per annum represents less than 1% of the superpower green iron vision. So these are some pretty serious numbers. Now, running through the different energy inputs, we can, apologies, Max. The different energy inputs, we can see that water production is a minor consideration. This is not to say that water availability in practice will be minor. Electricity for hydrogen production in the light pastel blue makes up at least 60% of total energy across all iron-making routes, assuming stoichiometric reduction of 54 kilograms of hydrogen per ton of HBI, and electrolyzer efficiency of 55 megawatt hours per ton of hydrogen. Moving to pelletization, the dark blue, we come to a substantial difference between the flexible and inflexible scenarios in that the flexible shaft technology does not require pellets as an input. This equates to energy and capex savings, the former being larger for hematite charge, given 60% of the required heat is provided by an exothermic reaction that takes place when pelletizing magnetite. According to technical reports published by ZESTY and Midrex, and assuming both have had electrical heaters installed, ZESTY is slightly more efficient in the reduction stage, as captured in orange. And finally, we see substantial differences required to smelt a low-quality hematite that is otherwise replaced by a very low-energy briquetting process for high-quality ores. So now that we've covered some of the energy inputs, we can look into the material input-output rationale. Our rationale follows high-level iron-making principles. And to describe the approach, I'll run through a stylistic example for the 62% hematite Midrex ESF route that would be applicable to the Pilbara, Kwinana, and Gladstone scenarios. Our model assumes that we start off with concentrated fines arriving at the door of our plant. The gang ratio in black is implied by the given level of iron content in dark blue, which in this case is considered as pure hematite, but in practice will be a combination of minerals. Once pelletized, we assume a loss in moisture content, but no other compositional changes. These pellets then go into the reduction shaft, in this case, a Midrex shaft with a 94% metallization rate to achieve 80% total metal iron content, denoted as FeMet in pastel blue. Hot metal then goes into the ESF, which performs a gang removal function until the stated 85% total metal iron content goal is achieved. In practice, the ESF will perform some reduction on the remaining Fe and oxygen. And with that, I'll hand back over to Max, who will go through some sensitivities and more insights from the model.
Thank you very much, Ben. Yes, as I mentioned, the sensitivities were something which was fun to pull together, which we put into the appendix of the report, and it's good to have this opportunity to give them the light of day. So the first form of sensitivity we did was a fairly traditional tornado analysis. We evaluated a number of different key inputs and looked at what would happen if we took them to a feasible low and a feasible high value. And we looked at that across different iron-making technologies for one location in particular, for the Eyre Peninsula. As Ben pointed out earlier, network charge was something that we felt there was quite a lot of uncertainty over, but in the end didn't make a huge difference on the final levelized cost of iron. Worth noting that that's the network charge which is applied to wholesale spot market imports only. The actual cost of transmitting renewable energy from the solar farm and the wind farm to the iron making facility is directly costed as a capital cost, which is then recovered. We also looked at the electricity to hydrogen conversion factor. We felt that was important given the amount of work going into looking at the efficiency of different electrolyzers. Again, not a huge input. And we also looked at the impact of the variability or the uncertainty in the iron making capital cost, particularly for the flexible technology, because it's a lower technology readiness level. And that had some level of input, but by far the dominant impact is the weighted average cost of capital. Our baseline assumption was 4.5% above the rate of inflation as our cost of capital. The high was 6% and the low was 3.6%. As you can see, it makes a big potential difference on the cost of iron. It's a very capital intensive system. And there's a greater difference for the inflexible technology than the flexible technology, because the inflexible technology is more capital intensive than the flexible technology. We also looked at the variability in our hourly inputs as well. As I mentioned earlier, and then Ben went into more detail on our hourly inputs were based on historic weather and spot market price data. So we decided not to go down the route of attempting to simulate market price data. That was a whole other project in itself. But what that did mean is we were constrained to available historic data sets. Now we picked 2023 as our representative year because there was less global economic disruption than some of the earlier years, and it's relatively recent as well. We're able to use that for the East Coast cases. But we also rerun the model for the Eyre Peninsula looking at data from 2021 when the average price of wholesale electricity was lower, and for 2022 when it was much higher due to the Russian war on Ukraine. Interesting to see the variation in results in the inflexible technology versus the flexible technology. So there are two lines for each technology type here. The darker line is our baseline. That includes the export of electricity back to the grid. The lighter line is if we exclude those electricity exports. So the inflexible technology does more of its work off-grid. The grid connection is a smaller part of the answer, and so it's not so affected by wholesale electricity prices. But it's a different story for the flexible technology, and it's most interesting when you look to the much higher prices in 2022 to observe the behavior of the model. For the core cases where we do include the impact of electricity exports, we see that actually the levelized cost of iron drops. Now that's important to note that that's the cost of iron, including the revenue which is generated from the sale of electricity back to the grid during certain high price events. So the model is operating flexibly and able to benefit from doing that. And thus we see a reduction in the cost of iron. On the other hand, if exports are included and the model is more of a taker of a price of grid electricity, just using it to firm when it makes sense to do so, we see the price actually rises. And so how you operate your plant in a high price scenario seems to have quite a big impact. Now, the final part of the sensitivity picture which I want to talk through is the actual variation which comes from the optimization process. So the optimization process uses a genetic algorithm. What that means is it does a run of 50 results, and then it takes the lowest cost of iron of those 50 results, and it uses the combination which got to that lowest cost to seed the next generation of results, and then it shakes things up a little bit. There's some randomization, and it runs another 50 runs based on that. Typically, that happens 9 times to get us to a result. Now, to ensure a fair comparison between the 10 different cases, we ran each model optimization once, and we took that optimized result as the base result. But I wanted to dive deeper in one particular location to see what would happen if we ran the optimization model multiple times. We ran it nearly 50 times for the Eyre Peninsula. So what you can see in the graph on the screen at the moment is that for the flexible technology, the optimization results are relatively consistent. The vast majority of them fall within a $10 per ton band. It just so happens that the baseline result, that very first result which we chose to use, happens to be one of the very lowest that we generated. For the inflexible technology, the spread is broader. So our baseline result was $1,040 per ton. You can actually achieve almost $30 less than that through multiple runs. So that suggests that our baseline result is actually slightly conservative for the inflexible technology. But the more interesting question is why? Why are these two things so different to each other? And it goes back to my favorite graph, these dots, and the optimization front, which I talked through earlier. So for the flexible technology, we are picking a solution at the bottom of that optimization front. So the rate of change of that front is very low at that point. You could get a different set of results which would move that whole front up or down very slightly, and you wouldn't have a big change in the results. On the other hand, for the inflexible technology, we're right up at the 100% utilization point, a much steeper part of the optimization front. And any small variation in what that front looks like can knock on through to quite a big change in the levelized cost of iron that you take as the optimal solution for the inflexible technology. So one of the takeaways from that was that if we were to do this again or focus in more detail on a particular location, we would actually do multiple optimization runs, particularly for the inflexible technology. A couple of insights from the model then, just to finish off. There are plenty more insights in the report and, of course, lots of policy recommendations which have been covered in previous webinars, but we just picked two to talk through. The first was about the relationship between the grid capacity and the cost of iron. In this analysis, we constrained the capacity of the grid for the flexible and inflexible cases in the Eyre Peninsula. The dark blue line is the inflexible case, and we can see that when we constrain the grid capacity below 500 megawatts down to 0, the cost of iron production increases very significantly. And this is what you would expect. It's difficult to run an inflexible plant without access to that grid electricity. Just to note that these graphs were generated by rerunning the optimization multiple times with different grid constraints in place. So the model was able to try and find the best combination of its individual components to deliver within the constraints of the grid capacity. For the for the flexible technology, we also see a relationship between the cost of iron and the grid capacity, but it's not nearly as pronounced. That makes sense. The flexible technology can operate around that constraint much more effectively. The main reason that the cost of the cost of iron is lower still for the flexible technology when you have a larger grid capacity is you have the ability to export up to that grid capacity as well. So you get the benefit that I mentioned earlier of the revenue from electricity generation and selling that back into the electricity grid. Hydrogen storage. This is looking at 3 different inflexible cases in the Pilbara, the Eyre Peninsula and Gladstone. So the Pilbara off-grid, you take away the ability to store hydrogen, and unsurprisingly, that leads to the need to overbuild the system, and so that pushes up prices quite a bit. Of course, you can overdo it the other way, and you can build too much hydrogen storage, and that will start costing you money instead. At the bottom, we see in the Eyre Peninsula, the inflexible case is much less affected by changing the amount of hydrogen storage because there's that other option of using the grid. Now, the interesting one to look at is the middle line, Gladstone. That does have the grid connection, so it's got the same option as the Eyre Peninsula, but it's got a higher emissions intensity of the grid power which is available. So that's an additional constraint, which means that hydrogen storage proves more useful in Gladstone than in the Eyre Peninsula. So just before we get to the Q&A, just a couple of closing thoughts. I would just like to highlight that I know that we are not the first organization to study green iron in Australia, and we certainly won't be the last. There's lots of people doing great work in this area, but we do feel that we've taken a step forward through the depth and breadth of analysis which we've undertaken here. And on a personal note, I would just like to thank Ben, Ingrid, and the rest of the TSI team for working with me on this piece of work. It's been an absolute privilege to work on. We think it's a timely report and hopefully an important contribution to the development of the green iron industry in Australia. Okay, I'll hand back to the TSI team to shepherd us through Q&A.
Thank you so much, Max. Very quickly, before we jump into questions, I do want to quickly tie today's presentation back to the broader context of our work on green iron. The results generated by Max's model have provided a chance for us to look around the corner and to anticipate what a green iron industry might look like in Australia, and also to examine the effects of our recommendations on the costs of green iron. Crucially, these cost estimates, which Max displayed earlier, demonstrate that with efficient policies, green iron produced in low-cost locations in Australia can compete with carbon-intensive iron. So in our report, we recommend policies that correct for the missing international carbon price, innovation spillovers, and the under-provision of the common user infrastructure that green iron producers will need. We, of course, go into a lot of detail on these themes, drawing even more heavily on the results from the model that you had a glimpse at today. So if you are interested in the report or more detail, we really encourage you to take a look at our website, where you can not only find the detailed information on our inputs that Ben talked about earlier, but also the report itself, and a sort of condensed executive summary, if that's useful. So enough from me. I'll now turn to questions. We have one here from John Pye. I'll read it out, and then Max and Ben can decide between them who is the better person to respond to this. The focus of John's question is on the way that we model flexibility. So specifically, he asks whether we assumed limited ramping rates for the flexible technology, and whether we considered energy losses in that ramping. So when a portion of the plant goes offline and then later comes back online. So that's the two questions about flexible technology.
Yep.
And then there's one about inflexible technology and how we modeled it, whether we assumed absolutely no flexibility there, or whether we allowed for some ramping at all with the inflexible technology. So that's on the flexibility we have. Did we assume any limitation on ramping rates or energy loss? And for inflexibility, did we assume any ramping at all?
Yeah.
Ben, Max, I'll pass across to one or both of you to tackle that.
So I'll be happy to pick that one up. And John, thank you very much for the question, because they are important questions and they highlight some of the limitations of what we've included in this model at the moment. We engaged with a number of different technology companies to try and understand what their technologies were capable of before we went away and built that into the model. And we had a particularly strong engagement with Calix about the Zesty process. I was actually surprised by the level of flexibility which they are claiming for their process, that it is possible to turn it down within a small number of minutes. And so you can achieve that hour-by-hour variability. We, in this particular model, have not included the changes in efficiency, which you mentioned, or indeed any specific limit on ramping rates. As an aside, in subsequent models, which I've built for other purposes, I have done that. So I have some understanding of the impact that it makes. The original, the modeling constraint, which makes it challenging to tackle, is once you include a constraint on ramp rates, then you get back into how you handle that upstream in terms of making sure that you've got the right amount of hydrogen and electricity to support a certain ramp rate, which is going to happen in future. And our model was hour by hour, so there's no forecasting aspect to our model. It doesn't make decisions based on what it thinks is going to happen over the next few hours. Regarding your question on inflexibility, we made the assumption that there needed to be 100% uptime in most situations. We found that we actually had to relax that a little bit in the Pilbara because it's just such a hard requirement when you're off-grid. So the results presented in the Pilbara, and there's a footnote in the report on this, are for 98% utilization.
Thank you very much, Max. I've got another question here. I've got one from Jeff Brooks, who makes the point that the history of pyrometallurgical processing shows that operating continuously 24 hours a day is generally the most profitable approach to iron making. So his questions, he has two. One is he asks why we think our scenarios or our results are so different. And then sort of related to that, he asks, wouldn't a large user of electricity generally negotiate a lower 24-hour rate, cost rate for electricity supply so that you could, for example, maintain that continuity of production? So those two things are related. I think they probably need a bit of a dive into the sort of the way electricity is sourced and used in our model, and whether under different scenarios it would be possible to get a 24-hour supply at a particular rate in different locations.
Yep, thank you. Ben, I'll jump in on that one again, if that's okay. So in terms of the historical reality of it being more profitable to operate continuously 24 hours a day, Jeff, I'm sure you will know much more about that than me, and I'm sure that's true. What we wanted to explore here was what we might be able to achieve with new and emerging technologies. And our goal was to give an indication of what that flexibility may be able to deliver to you. What I thought was particularly interesting was that we were taking a system-wide view to achieve that. So rather than just looking at the capital utilization of the iron-making plant, we're actually knocking that back on through to what's the cost of your hydrogen, therefore what's the cost of your electricity. Which gets into your second point. There are a number of different ways in which this would happen in reality commercially. So the likelihood is, very high likelihood, is that you wouldn't actually have this completely vertically integrated system. Instead, you would have the iron-making facility maybe integrate with the hydrogen facility, maybe not, but it would have a PPA for the electricity. And that PPA would be subject to negotiation between the electricity generation and the user of the electricity about how those costs were passed on through the prices in the PPA structure. That's a whole commercial aspect which we chose not to tackle. Instead, we wanted to look at this much more simplistically, really, as what's the total cost of the system to achieve a desired outcome. One thing which impacts that, which we haven't talked about so far, is how you interpret the requirements under the hydrogen production tax incentive to meet the emissions constraints. If you're able to use renewable energy guarantee of origin certificates, that can significantly alter how those constraints impact your operational profile. And that would in turn, if there was PPAs included, then impact what your PPA looks like as well. So the summary of all of that is it's a complicated area and there's so much more to drive into there. We feel that we've opened the door to some interesting questions, and there's much more work which needs to be done to investigate the potential of things like flexibility further.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Rob Kelly on whether or not we investigated potential industrial symbiosis to improve the reliability of variable renewable energy, and therefore the overall capacity of the industrial production that your model captures, Max.
Okay, so I love this question, Rob, because the question of industrial symbiosis and multiple users of renewable electricity driving down the costs for everyone by operating together as one system is actually where this model came from in the first place. I did a piece of work looking at the Oakajee proposed industrial precinct in Western Australia about a year and a half ago, looking at this very question. There's plenty more work to do in this area as well. So it's actually really the next thing that we're thinking about with TSI is what additional benefits can we get from the industrial symbiosis. So I don't have a clear answer yet, but I hope we will have a clear answer soon.
Thank you very much. There are so many questions, so apologies if I'm not getting to yours. I'm trying to tackle them as they come in. So apologies to anyone whose question hasn't been asked yet, but I'm working my way through. We have a question about electrolyzers and the sensitivity of the results in the model to electrolyzer efficiency. So whether or not we considered the different but plausible efficiencies reported for, say, solid oxide electrolyzer cell technology, because those get a very high efficiency rate using water heat to produce steam. So which would seem plausible in the context of a green iron plant. The question notes that they're not yet commercially mature, but could become so like within the timeline that we're considering for green iron production.
In some ways, quite an easy one to answer. We didn't look at solid oxide electrolyzers, but I totally agree that if you've got that source of industrial heat, then it's the ideal environment to operate them.
If I can jump in quickly as well, in terms of the sensitivities that we did look at, we focused purely on PEM electrolyzers, and with the model was focused on 2030 being the rollout of this first of a kind plant. And so we based our high on what is currently commercially possible, based on Oricon data, and then ramped down a bit of the way to what is viewed as quite an optimistic 50 megawatt hours per ton of hydrogen, which has been reported by the likes of the IEA. And so we landed on a midpoint at 55, but in terms of the technology use, we did focus specifically on PEM because of its readiness and its flexible capacity.
Thank you very much. I've got a question here from Changlong on the way that the system kind of optimizes across sort of hourly data, for example, and whether or not your system uses perfect foresight, Max, first of all, and if it does, what that means for dependence on sort of the quality of estimates into the future for the optimization process.
Yep. So I partially answered this earlier. We don't include any foresight in the model at the moment. Its control method is based on not knowing what is coming next. I think this whole, we didn't intend to make the interaction with the grid a huge part of this study, and it sort of snowballed as we went through it, that became more and more interesting thread to pull on. And at some point we had to finish the report, right? So there is so much more here to do to really understand like what the true benefits are of this system operating as part of a broader energy system. And I what I'm very happy with is I think it's led us in a very interesting area of investigation for TSI and others.
Thank you. I've got a question here about that's specific to white hydrogen, but I think it's probably a question that can be applied across the full spectrum of hydrogen colors. So we're being asked why we didn't look at any kind of colors, types of hydrogen apart from green hydrogen. So the specific question is about white hydrogen, which is from underground sources. But yes, a question about our specific focus on green hydrogen and what motivated that.
Yeah. Would anyone, I'm happy to try and answer it, but would anyone from TSI like to answer that one? Because it sort of relates to the bounds of our system design, I guess.
Yeah, sure. I guess the North Star for going with a cleaner hydrogen was, I guess, the namesake of our report and what is currently being discussed and hasn't really been decided upon at any international level on the definition of what is green iron. And so there's a spectrum to greenness, and within that spectrum, you can be actually quite dirty in the end. But our focus on clean and mostly green hydrogen, I think stems from the fact that we wanted a clean product coming out the other side. For that reason, I don't think we really ventured into any other forms of hydrogen other than those that would be produced by energy generating assets with help from the grid, but with that being limited, of course.
And thanks, Ben. The other thing I'd add to that is that the work we do at TSI is very much motivated by a focus on Australia's comparative advantage as the world decarbonises. And so because Australia has such exceptional renewable energy resources which can be harnessed at low cost, that brings green hydrogen under the umbrella of green products where Australia will have a comparative advantage. In addition to that, that long-term lens, it's also the case that from a modelling perspective, it was very useful to work with the carbon constraints imposed by the government's green hydrogen production tax incentive, which is in place for green iron producers and other end users using green hydrogen. So there was a sort of very much an economic comparative advantage motivation for our focus on green hydrogen, but also a practical one. So we could look at what it would mean for producers in Australia working to capitalise on existing policies that are in place. We've only got 3 minutes left. And so I think very quickly, just a question here about what we might do in the future. So will, for example, we look at molten electrolysis in a future study? Very, very quickly, either of you can take it and then we'll wrap up, I think.
Well, I don't know if I can answer for TSI's future work program, but I can say it's very interesting. And I think that some of the conclusions that we've drawn around flexibility, looking at how those can apply to different technologies, not just hydrogen-based technologies, is something which is worthy of further study because it helps to build the case for research and development into those technologies.
That's it. So on that note, I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us today, who has given up their lunch times to learn more about everything under the hood of our green iron production model. Thank you to Max from Bivios for joining today. This has been a truly collaborative piece of work that has, as Max signalled, really developed and grown as we've delved into the project. And it has, as signalled by that final question there, it really is the basis of a number of future pieces of work that we would like and hope to do. So if you would like to stay up to date on the research that we're doing here at TSI, you can sign up for our newsletter at our website, and you can find a whole raft of resources there on this topic and others. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you at future TSI webinars.